Colin, to save bandwidth, we're all trying to delete our video unless we're talking, but please don't do the same. Please stay on video as you are. Thank you.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to our webinar program. My name is Fred Clark, and I'm the Executive Director of Wisconsin's Green Fire. And we're excited today to host a program with Colin O'mara, the Executive Director of the National Wildlife Federation, on conservation policy in the Biden-Harris administration. So thank you for taking time to join us, and we're excited for today's program. I'm joined today by George Meyer, the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Wildlife Federation, and our two organizations together are co-hosting this event. There, we haven't done a webinar in a little while. Wisconsin's Green Fire supports the conservation legacy of Wisconsin by promoting science-based management of natural resources. Our members work throughout Wisconsin on issues including air quality, climate change, energy, environmental education, fisheries, wildlife, forestry, public lands, water resources, environmental protection, public trust in wetlands, and working with young professionals. There, I made it through that list. We're a broad-based membership organization of conservation professionals, and it's our mission to restore the role of science, professional expertise, and responsible management in our environmental and natural resources programs. We encourage you to learn more about Wisconsin's Green Fire. If you're a member already, thank you. If you're not, we'll be following up with you with more information very shortly after this program. So we're excited today to have our guest, Colin O'Mara, with us, and we want to learn more about what we know, what we can expect, and the things that we'll need to be paying attention to and be working for in the next 4 years and beyond with the new Biden administration. There is never a more important time right now to turn the corner, to address the acute issues that we're facing with water quality, with biodiversity, with the broad needs for conservation protection in this country and in the world, and addressing the existential threat of climate change. There's no better time to have this conversation, and there's no better person to have it with than Colin today. So we're excited. And with that, I just want to point to a couple of logistical items for us. Most of us have gotten very familiar with Zoom, but up in the upper right corner of your screen, you'll see some view options if you want to see the gallery of those panelists, or if you want to see the speaker view, you can control that. We will be taking questions throughout the second half of the program, and Kathleen Falk will be moderating our questions. If you would like to direct a question for Colin to address, please put it in the chat box and send it to us. And Kathleen will be moderating that. Also, if you're having any technical difficulties or if there's anything we should know about sound or audio, please also send a chat to Sarah Peterson. Sarah will be providing technical support and background for us during the program today. If any one of us appear to be a cat, please let us know that as soon as possible, and we'll try to resolve that as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our friend and colleague and a strong supporter of Wisconsin's Green Fire, the organization I lead, George Meyer. And George, as many of you know, served a long career in conservation in Wisconsin, both for over 33 years with the Department of Natural Resources, including service as secretary, and since 2003 as the executive director of the Wisconsin Wildlife Federation. But there are a few people who have been more instrumental in conservation on so many different issues in the state than George. And he's announced recently that he'll be retiring in July from his current role at Wisconsin Wildlife Federation. And we're going to be recognizing his work with us and with others over the course of the next few months. So George, thanks for being with us today. You'll need to unmute though.
Thank you very much, Fred. And to everyone in the audience, we share a very good partnership with Green Fire, which plays such an important role of assuring good science is being applied to conservation and environmental protection in the state. Wisconsin Wildlife Federation is made up of sporting clubs throughout the state and individual members. We have over 200 sports clubs we represent in the state. We work on the full range, though, of conservation and environmental issues that you would think of, could think of. We are an affiliate of the National Wildlife Federation, and very proud to help sponsor this and share what we've known for a long time is the skills and knowledge of Colin O'Mara, who is the executive director or CEO of the National Wildlife Federation. We're one of 53 affiliates of that organization, and we form a very strong group as one federation is what all the affiliates combine as to advance sound conservation policy at a federal level. This is a great opportunity as we have a new administration that appears to be very conservation and environmentally concerned. And we are encouraging the national, in fact, at our board meeting coming up, we're going through a list of things we're going to ask the national to work on that affect us. In the past, we've continue to work great closely with the National Wildlife Federation, land conservation, water fund reauthorization, Great Outdoors Act, Asian carp. But some of the things that we think really need to be done are getting rid of the poor version of the Waters of the United States Act, getting rid of the changes that are made to the Migratory Bird Act, which allow polluters not to have to pay for killing thousands of birds, getting some environmental standards by EPA nationwide for PFAS, restoring the mercury regulations that were weakened by the former administration. And very importantly, as I'm sure will be discussed by Colin, is passage of the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. So with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this discussion, my good friend, long-term friend, Kathy Falk. Kathy and I go back over 40 years. When I was a young lawyer with the Wisconsin DNR, she was the executive director of Wisconsin Environmental Decade, which you would know now as Clean Wisconsin, a very premier environmental organization. She then moved on to be Wisconsin's public intervener, shared with Tom Dawson, her colleague, where she was so instrumental in affecting environmental policy in the state. And I was a lawyer at DNR, and we had many collaborative efforts in regard to that. And then when I was DNR secretary, she was the county executive in Dane County. I think one of the most memorable things we worked on was protection of the Baraboo Bluffs and the Highway 12 corridor to make sure that stayed in a natural condition. And I think that's been a very successful partnership. So let me turn it over to Kathleen, and she'll host the remainder of the program.
Thank you, George. And we've had many, many good fights together, and I know we have many good fights in front of us yet, despite your upcoming retirement. But I want to thank you for your lifelong service. I first saw you when you were navigating the very difficult and contentious spearfishing issues between the state of Wisconsin and our tribal nations. And you did it so respectfully and successfully on behalf of us all. Thank you for that. But then 30 years of hard work on the DNR and then your leadership as secretary for really issues, simple issues like mining regulations and mercury levels. But you then went on for the last 17 years to lead the Wisconsin Wildlife Federation. And it's no surprise that you were inducted into our Conservation Hall of Fame a few years ago. And that most recently you received the very prestigious National Wildlife Federation Charlie Shaw Partnership Award. So thank you, George, for your lifelong service.
You're very kind, Kathleen.
You leave big shoes, but fortunately I have the good pleasure here of introducing very big shoes that have been filled for his lifelong service and our guest that we are so honored to have join us today. Colin O'Mara is the president of the National Wildlife Federation, America's largest wildlife conservation organization, with 53 state and territorial affiliates and nearly 6 million members. Under Colin's leadership, the National Wildlife Federation is focused on recovering America's wildlife, ranging from bison and bighorn sheep to pollinators like monarch butterflies and native bees, improving the management of and access to our public lands, restoring America's water bodies, and advancing environmental education, including things like the Ranger Rick magazines, and particularly with connecting every American child with the great outdoors. I know he has a 3-year-old who's teaching all about the outdoors. We've had the pleasure of seeing. Oh, Colin serves on many boards and in many national capacities, but to give you an idea of the respect he has and earned is in 2015, he was named Bass Pro Shops Conservation Partner of the Year. He is regularly called to testify before Congress on all of our behalfs to protect wildlife and water. Prior to his leadership of the National Wildlife Federation, Colin O'Mara was the Delaware's top DNR official, leading that Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control from 2009 to 2014. He spearheaded a range of initiatives, including Delaware's No Child Left Inside campaign, which I think is really nifty, to introduce every child to the outdoors. It's our future. We led the first state Trails and Pathways plan. We created the Delaware Bayshore Initiative to restore that area as a leading area for hunting, birding, fishing, hiking, kayaking, canoeing. While he's a native of Syracuse, New York, he has earned many distinguished awards, including the Marshall Scholar at the University of Oxford and a Presidential Scholar at Dartmouth College. He is a U.S. Green Building Council LEED accredited professional. I don't know how he has time to do that, besides earning a management degree at Stanford, where I also hail from. He still lives in Delaware, and he spends every possible moment he can with those 2 great daughters of his and his wife. With this bio, it is no surprise that over the last year, he also stepped up in his individual capacity, not as the leader of NFF, to be a leader for a group called Sportsmen and Sportswomen for Biden, where a group of bipartisan leaders across the state, including our own former DNR Secretary Scott Hassett and myself and others from Wisconsin, joined this group to help focus on the difference in the track records of President Trump from what we believed a President Biden administration would be. Very recently, Colin, myself, and a number of others had the pleasure of being on a Zoom call with our new Department of Interior Secretary designee, Congresswoman Deb Haaland, and our new EPA Administrator designee, Michael Regan. And I know that right now Colin is spending a great bulk of his time working with the incoming leaders as well as the new president to advance the agenda that everyone joining us on this call shares. Colin will do some introductory remarks on those issues that he knows are key to our Badger state and nation, and then we will turn this over to a half an hour of questions and comments from the fabulous group of participants that join us today. With no further ado, it is my great honor to introduce Colin O'Mara. Thank you for joining us.
Great. No, thank you, Kathleen. And thank you for the invitation. A few weeks ago, when I got the email from Kathleen to be able to meet with you all today, I jumped at the chance. And frankly, it's because when I was a very young, 29-year-old secretary in the state of Delaware, a lot of the innovative programs that we were trying to put in place, at least folks thought were innovative here. I ripped off from the Wisconsin DNR, particularly around like wetlands protection and really the focus on kind of holistic approaches to water quality and really thinking about systems in a big way. And it really is, the leadership of all of you that provided that leadership, which also just gave me great, trepidation when I saw, kind of the meat cleaver that was taken to so many resources of the agency over so many years during the Walker administration. I was at the time trying to make the case for building a wetlands program similar to your former program to the EPA, trying to make the case for full-blown delegation with that in the Corps. In the Army Corps, and at the same time seeing these institutions that I held in such reverence being challenged. And if it wasn't for all of you, fighting in the legislature, fighting in commissions, making the case for resources, for science-based management, for good policy, I can only imagine what would have happened. So it was my absolute pleasure when Kathleen and Fred reached out. Now, being a good Federation member, I did ask George for permission first. So I got together with George to make sure that that the partnership was strong and that the partnership between the Wisconsin Wildlife Federation and Green Fire was great, and obviously it is. And the historical legacy of all you've done to come together to champion our natural resources is just really incredible, and frankly a great model. One I'd love to see in more states, because I do think it's unique, bringing together so many conservation advocates, so many professional biologists, wildlife professionals from the different natural resource agencies, both past and present. Before I begin, I did want to thank some of my team that are with us today. So Jason Dinsmore, who many of you know, who is a phenomenal director of conservation partnership, that is kind of our lead partner with the Wisconsin Wildlife Federation. I'm really excited that he's with us today. I also want to thank Denise Poliak, who's doing a great job doing regional field organizing on climate issues. And then one of my board members, I don't know if Cody's on yet, Cody Kamrowski, who many of you know, has been a great board member for George, one of the great young leaders in the Federation family. And he's on my board. I think he may be the youngest or the second youngest member of my board. He's done just a great job. And I don't know if Todd Ames is on also, but one of my favorite Federation family members who ran the Healing Our Waters Coalition masterfully before he joined the governor's staff with the agency. Just another great champion. I wanted to take a few minutes today at the top to talk a little bit about how I see the kind of the national landscape playing out and how various priorities in Wisconsin are going to fit into that landscape. And I'll start on the administrative side, then go through congressional, and then maybe go through some state stuff just as a basic framework. But look, just being very, very blunt with all of you, the president is incredibly indebted to the people of Wisconsin. If it wasn't for the people of Wisconsin, the people of Michigan, a few other places, a second Trump term could very well be underway. And so I think, kind of with that great power, kind of comes great responsibility to do right on a whole bunch of regional priorities that frankly haven't received enough attention for the last several years. You're going to continue to hear the president-elect, or the president, I got to get used to calling him the president, talk a lot about kind of how he sees these four historic interlocking challenges and how to manifest policy that addresses all of them. So the four challenges that he talks about are the pandemic, the racial reckoning that we're experiencing after centuries of racial injustice, the economic kind of catastrophe that we're facing with mass unemployment levels we haven't seen since the Great Depression, combined with climate change and kind of environmental degradation. And so those four challenges are kind of front and center for everything they're doing. That's why they're moving right now with a $1.9 billion COVID response package, which is obviously being debated right now and kind of put together. There's also behind that another multi-trillion-dollar proposal for an infrastructure package, which really presents a huge opportunity for investments in many of the things we care about. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. On the administrative side, in his first 20 days, you've already seen a significant number of actions trying to restore science, trying to restore kind of integrity of a lot of the regulatory processes that were hit hard over the last 4 years of the Trump administration. When one of the very first orders that he signed was in order to basically just challenge the agencies to go back and look at all the regulatory actions that were done over the last 4 years. And so that's everything from the waters of the US rule, the Clean Water Rule that George referenced. That's rules that weaken standards for everything from industrial sources and power plants to certain kinds of chemicals, and taking a look at those in a holistic way. And again, not directing them in terms of specific actions, but really kind of looking at the legal underpinning, whether they're meeting the statutory requirements, whether they're meeting the actual kind of scientific and scientific standards for kind of clean water and clean air and public health. And the process is already underway. And so there's a team of folks in the agencies that are beginning the process of kind of peeling back the onion, right, and kind of getting deep into these regulations and figuring out, what has to be taken down, what has to be changed, what has to be put back. Now, the challenge is, and this is one of the reasons I was so excited to be with all of you today, is that it's not simply a matter of policy, right? There's a massive personnel problem at the federal level, in that the staffing levels at EPA, at Interior, at NOAA are a fraction of what they were 10 years ago. And well, a lot of this didn't all happen under the Trump administration. Some of it happened under the Obama administration as part of the budget sequestration deals, but we're down thousands of positions at EPA right now. And it's not just the bodies, right? It's also the wisdom, it's the experience, it's the expertise that was lost at the same time. And so somebody used the analogy the other day of this administration having to try to rebuild the plane while flying it. It's actually a little more complicated than that, right? It's actually trying to rebuild kind of a fleet of airplanes simultaneously, that you're not only trying to rebuild kind of where they were, but actually making them even bigger and more powerful. And that's a lot, right? So the idea of trying to staff up in a way that meets the moment and has the scientific expertise, but can still move efficiently. It's not something that the federal government's done, particularly well over decades. And so you're going to see this big push around personnel. I think you can see a lot of, job postings. And so for folks that are professionals, you be ready for those if you dare to serve in the federal government, if you either again or for the first time. But I think there will be a lot of opportunities, because there is this massive need across the board, and it really is across all agencies. Obviously, we'll focus on the environmental ones for our conversation today, but when you think about the implications in other policy areas as well, it really is daunting. Now, some of the other first day actions that came out were rejoining the Paris Accords, kind of sending the letter to the other signatories saying we're planning on rejoining. What that really means in practice is we actually have to update our commitments, and that'll be done for later this year in Glasgow. The reason that's significant is that it is a way to roll up a whole bunch of commitments across the entire government. And it's a way to really kind of think through how all the different efforts that folks are making on the investment side, how folks are trying to think through, natural climate solutions, the industrial sector, the agriculture space, other major sources of emissions, kind of all fit together. And so you're going to see that work over the next several months. This is one of the reasons why John Kerry was brought back into government service to kind of serve as the international climate envoy, to help lead those negotiations. But obviously a huge part of the question, and look, and for Wisconsin, I don't need to tell you, right, the greater levels of precipitation, some of the impacts on wildlife populations, just all kinds of changes are already underway as a result of climate. So the need to act is absolutely right now. Another area that the administration focused on the first day was around kind of restoring some of the land protections. And a lot of these were more out west. There were national monuments like Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante in Utah that had been pulled back, as well as the proposed drilling in the Arctic, as well as there's a marine monument on the East Coast, the Canyons and Seamount Marine Monument off the coast of Rhode Island and Massachusetts. But again, starting the process again, right, of putting back protections that were there, and in ways that are really smart. And a lot of that first day was really about trying to repair what they perceived as some of the damages over the last 4 years. I was actually more excited about the announcements the following Wednesday, which didn't receive as much media coverage, but I just wanted to highlight for all of you. And this was a series of orders around kind of taking the next steps on climate and natural resource restoration. And there's a kind of the new phrase in DC is this idea of whole of government approach. So trying to have it not just be a regulatory action of EPA, but having all agencies helping on climate and doing it in ways that are both reducing emissions, but also bolstering resilience. Also really trying to find solutions that help create jobs in meaningful ways, and doing it all in ways that are incredibly helpful. Alana has decided to join us. She promised she's going to be napping right now, so I apologize. I'm going to do exactly what Kathy said I wasn't going to do on the phone by trying to get my daughter outside. I'm actually going to put her on a screen for a few minutes. I am embarrassed by this, but she's not supposed to be with us right now. So would you like to watch Octonauts for a few minutes?
Yep.
Okay. So, okay, Octonauts is a wonderful TV show if you have to have educational programming that is actually scientifically accurate about the marine environment. So anyways, I apologize for that. The orders on the Wednesday, the second Wednesday, this framework around climate it's incredibly impressive. And the reason I wanted to bring it up with all of you is that it sets up this kind of interagency kind of approach to thinking about impacts. And there's a couple in particular that have a couple of pieces in particular that I think are going to be important for Wisconsin. One piece is this commitment to conserve and restore 30% of lands by 2030. And this is something that Kathleen and I and others, worked on during the campaign. But the idea is we have degraded resources all across the country. And that, the leading scientists around the world have said if we don't get towards a place of conserving half of the land for biodiversity, for species, that we'll continue to see this massive march towards a sixth extinction. And in the US's case right now, there's more than 12,000 species that state wildlife agencies have identified as species of greatest conservation need. And that's not comprehensive because not all states, work on fauna, on flora. I apologize. This is that experience of kind of working, not so much working from home, but kind of living at work. Alana, sorry.
Colin, you don't need to apologize. We've all been there, and we're all having many of the same experiences. Please.
It's just a quick digression. So I was on a call with some of the other CEOs with the Speaker of the House, with Nancy Pelosi. And Alana decided that she was going to not only get dressed up to come in and be it, but actually trying to have a conversation with the speaker, who she recognized from television. So she comes in and in front of Speaker Pelosi, she asked her whether she likes her dress. And so I apologize, profusely. And the speaker has, I think, 8 kids or 9 kids, and she's got this amazing, huge family. And the speaker was like, no, Alana's so much more interesting than you are. Let her talk as much as she wants. Was kind of her reaction. So Kathleen, I appreciate your comment. So back to the administration. So the 30 by 30 framework, I think, is interesting because it creates a framework to kind of roll up a whole bunch of investments across the entire government in ways that are incredibly strategic. I think there's a bit of a battle for the soul of what it means. For me, we have so many degraded lands right now where you could deem them protected tomorrow, but if you don't have real investments on the ground to try to restore those functions, you're actually not gaining much from an ecological point of view. You might be reducing the damage, so you're avoiding kind of more bad from happening, but you're not necessarily gaining function, especially for species and for natural resource quality. And so one thing I'd love to have work with Green Fire on and with Wisconsin Wildlife Federation on is really thinking through what does it mean for Wisconsin? Where are the places that we should have more investment in natural resource restoration? Where are the places where revegetating buffers could reduce nitrogen and phosphorus pollution? Where are the places where maybe require an additional level of protection? And then how do we balance those equities? How do we make sure that we're not losing opportunities for outdoor recreation and hunting and fishing, but again, really protecting the best, kind of restoring the rest, and then having natural systems that are much healthier in the years and decades ahead. A lot of this is going to also connect to like wildlife migration and movement, thinking through how we evolve our systems of wildlife protection, because at the end of the day, our old model of conservation, where if I just protect, this patch of land that is, part of the migration or part of the range of a species, and that should be enough to protect it from all their impacts. We know that isn't sufficient, particularly as we're seeing climate impacts that are increasingly shifting and distorting these migratory patterns. So thinking about 30 by 30, not just in a spatial sense, but also thinking in a temporal sense, as you're trying to think about, where is the habitat going to be shifting, where the migration corridor is going to be moving towards, how do we make sure that connectivity and resource quality are interconnected in the way we're thinking. So huge opportunities there for leadership at the state level. Tammy Bolden's been deeply involved. You're a great senator. Ron Johnson, not quite so much. But I think it's a huge opportunity to be thinking through how your priorities fit into this bigger frame, which I do think is going to be an investment frame in a really smart way. Another really important part for me, and I appreciate a lot of your leadership on this, was a commitment by the president to relaunch the Civilian Conservation Corps. He's calling it the Civilian Climate Corps. This is going to build on years of great work by conservation corps on the ground across the country. I mean, there's amazing work going on through national service all across the country. No, Lana, go. Sorry. There's a huge opportunity for right now. We estimate as much as 35–40% of folks under 30 are either unemployed, furloughed, and unlikely to go back, or underemployed. And so, when you think about, I mean, you're talking, 15 million young people right now, and that's before you get to other older folks and others that may want to be involved in national service. We haven't had this kind of youth unemployment crisis in this country since the 1930s at this scale, and it's incredibly. I think finding solutions that kind of meet the magnitude of the moment are going to be incredibly important. And when you think about the economy right now, and you think about the sectors that have been hardest hit, places like retail, like hospitality and travel, things like restaurants. I mean, the overwhelming number of employees in those sectors are younger workers. They're often young people they're the last ones hired. They're the first ones fired. They're the last ones that are brought back. It's especially true towards individuals of color, youth of color, whether that's a black youth or Latino youth or indigenous youth. And so thinking through how we put a ton of folks to work doing meaningful projects. And for those of you that worked at state agencies, when we have our state wildlife action plans, we got our state forest action plans, we've got our state comprehensive outdoor recreation plans, we have our hazard mitigation plans, we have plans on top of plans on top of plans. I'm sure there are a million other state-led ones in Wisconsin as well. I mean, imagine if you had thousands of young people that you could put to work advancing the missions of the agency to do work that's been needed for a long time around invasives, around recreation, around restoration of natives. I mean, there's a whole range of work that could be done. I mean, bolstering resilience and helping do work on private lands. The opportunities are almost endless. And so the president's executive order actually teed up the agencies to really kind of start this conversation in a big way. And starting with existing money from the Great American Outdoors Act, which was a piece of legislation last year that permanently authorized the Land and Water Conservation Fund, as well as provided $9.5 billion for our national parks and wildlife refuges and national forests, BLM lands, and Bureau of Indian Schools. But there are huge opportunities. And so this is one thing we'll be pushing on, Congressman Kind and Congresswoman Moore, and as well as Congressman Posan and Congressman Gallagher and your whole delegation. I'm sure I'm forgetting a couple of them. I think you have 6 or 7. But this could be a huge way to connect the 30 by 30 restoration priorities with the needs of the labor force, which then brings me to kind of the piece that the administration is really setting up, which is this conversation on infrastructure. To give everybody kind of a small preview, on the 23rd, the president will give a State of the Union address. Hopefully by that point, the COVID package has already passed the Senate and the House and has already been signed, because the goal for that speech is to lay out an economic recovery vision that's heavily invested in an investment strategy around infrastructure. And this was working on that Kathleen and I worked on during the campaign, but the idea that we have to broaden the definition of infrastructure, also include natural infrastructure, and that we should be thinking about our waterways, our forests, our wetlands, our grasslands, all the work we could do around resilience, all the work we could do for wildlife recovery as part of this bigger package. And we believe that that there's a possibility to invest upwards of $200 billion, and 200 billion with a B, across the country over 5 years to restore our natural systems and bolster our resilience. And in doing so, you'd create about 3.5 million jobs all across the country. That's job years. But it's massive. I mean, it's a massive, massive, massive opportunity to advance so many of the things that we've been working on. And I'd argue that we've been in a scarcity kind of framework and scarcity challenge for decades now. And there are some things we can absolutely kind of regulate our way to achieve our goals, but a lot of things require investment and require collaboration, particularly on things on private lands. And outside of the Farm Bill and various programs, there just aren't a lot of other tools that have been at our disposal. I mean, you think about just using the state wildlife grants as an example. The state wildlife grants, spread $60 million across all 50 states for plans that individually, cost tens of millions of dollars to implement. And so, I mean, it's like we're orders of magnitude off from the level of investment that's needed. And so this is a way to rectify that in a big way. And so for all of you that are thinking about, kind of priorities in the state and how do we have capital for different projects, how do we leverage different kinds of money, this is the greatest opportunity. And the likelihood is after they spend this level of money, then DC will do what it does, but it'll go back to the other extreme of kind of fiscal austerity and not wanting to spend money again. And so this is kind of the moment. And so I would love to hear from you, whether it's in the chat or during the Q&A, about big priorities in Wisconsin that should be part of these conversations. Because I do think, obviously, as I said at the top, you're in a high leverage position, both because of good elected officials, but also because of the role that you played in the election itself. Now, obviously, you can't have this conversation without talking about the Great Lakes. And I think the Great Lakes, as a political region, probably has never had more political power. You think about the delegation in Michigan, Governor Whitmer, obviously very close to the president, and it kind of continues across the Great Lakes states. Governor Walz up in Minnesota as well, and Amy Klobuchar, of course, playing a major role, Tina Smith. And so you think through kind of the politics and the power of the region. The importance for the region to come together with that big ask has never been more important. And I think, frankly, our work, our Great Lakes Regional Center that's based out in Ann Arbor, has been doing a lot of work with the Healing Our Waters Coalition that many of you are a part of, Laura Rubin and the great team there, really trying to think through what does that big comprehensive kind of platform look like for the Great Lakes. And there's lots of different moving pieces. I think there's obviously a huge piece around just kind of protecting and restoring the Great Lakes. And we have a document we can share with all your members if you're interested. This is, getting up, increasing the funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, making sure that we're really thinking through the next level of investments, and particularly thinking through how we're going to reduce some of the non-point runoff that obviously is causing massive algal blooms in Lake Erie and other places. The need around drinking water, and this is everything from in a more urban context, lead in the pipes in Flint or in Detroit, to nitrates in drinking wells and other issues in more rural parts of the state. And thinking through those systems together, obviously PFAS becomes part of this conversation in a big way. And I appreciate this group's kind of focus and leadership on that. And I'll get back to that in a minute. In addition to the Great Lakes, we also want to think about restoring the Ohio and the Mississippi and these kind of working waterways that don't receive nearly enough attention. So I think there's a big opportunity there for movement. But where we spend $300 to $400 million a year on the Great Lakes, we spend a fraction of that on the Ohio, which is the most polluted waterway in the country, just from criteria pollutants, and the Mississippi, obviously, which has been distorted in so many ways, causing pretty harmful ecological impacts. And so yet another area where there could be great bipartisan support, just like there is for the Great Lakes, but something that could be a big opportunity. Now, we also want to see better wildlife management. Obviously, you have incredible wildlife in Wisconsin, some of the best in the country when it comes to cervids in particular. And at the same time, thinking through how we manage and provide resources through an infrastructure conversation around risks like chronic wasting disease, and making sure that wildlife management is a central piece of the recovery, because we know that investments in wildlife management do create a ton of jobs, particularly the habitat work, because it's more labor intensive. There's kind of fewer materials. There's less equipment needed in some cases, but there's a ton of opportunities there. And so I'm really excited about some of the opportunities. I think the biggest opportunity in this space is a bill called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which George has been a big champion on for his entire tenure. But the idea behind this is to fully fund the state wildlife action plans to try to save the 12,000 species of greatest conservation need across the country. And at a time when 1/3 of all species are at heightened risk of extinction, frankly, we can't only depend on the Endangered Species Act once species already reached the brink of collapse. And so, we're going to start seeing more and more petitions for listing. I mean, there's already 1,600 plants and wildlife species on the endangered species list, either threatened or endangered. There could be another several thousand behind them in the next few years, unless we get ahead and start making investments in a big way. And so the Recovering America's Wildlife Act is one of these type of investments. I think for Wisconsin specifically, which obviously that's important for Wisconsin. I mean, I think Wisconsin gets $20 million annually through the program, which would significantly increase your wildlife diversity program's budget, I'm guessing several fold. But also we need to get more money for chronic wasting disease. There need to get more money to the states. Obviously, it's been a huge challenge across the Great Lakes, but frankly, across the country. The numbers are getting scary, and we don't have nearly the science commitment that we need to really understand the prion. And at the same time, we don't have the testing and the facilities to know kind of the patterns of movement and really kind of thinking through how we solve that challenge. So a huge, huge, huge opportunity there. Other opportunities on the wildlife side around migration, and investing both in crossings as well as connecting corridors. So a lot of opportunities there. I mean, I'd love to fund recovery plans for listed species, help species recover. I'd love to see some of the joint venture work be funded too, potentially as a way to bring back species. But again, the wildlife bucket, I think, is another one that makes a lot of sense for the Great Lakes, just given your amazing species, from your magnificent moose to your Kirtland warblers and everything in between. Pretty spectacular resource you all are blessed to be near. And then there's going to be a lot of focus on environmental justice, investing in kind of the next generation, really trying to clean up legacy pollution, as well as kind of addressing some of the current harms and the injustices that we see about kind of where pollution is located and how it affects different communities. So you'll see a lot of investments there. And then there'll also be a big focus on climate resiliency. And so again, I mean, a huge opportunities, I think, for the Great Lakes to speak as one. And I think one thing I would encourage all of you, to the extent you're able to kind of advocate on the policy side, is really encouraging the collaboration, because we saw in the 2009 recovery that when individuals all just advocate for their one little thing, they might get a fraction of what they want. But there's a kind of a NATO power where folks really join forces across regions and use their leverage, particularly in fairly divided bodies. You have a 50-50 Senate and a House majority of only a few members. If a block of folks together, say between Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan, all said, hey, like, we all need X, Y, and Z for you to get our votes on this package, it's pretty compelling, especially when it's things that align with the president's priorities. So I would just encourage you to think big. I mean, there's no reason why we're not talking about bringing, tens of billions of dollars of investment into the Great Lakes and into Wisconsin over the next few years, which is just absolutely massive and would be transformative. And I think that's going to be the big piece in Congress. I mean, that's going to be the big centerpiece. And I'm just really looking forward to working with all of you to make sure that natural resources are a big part of that. So we're not just kind of repairing the Eisenhower highway system of the 50s, but we're really kind of thinking towards the future in smart ways. I think we'll also see a huge investment in clean energy, of course, and hopefully some of that can be bipartisan. Huge investments in building stocks and energy efficiency in the industrial sector, hopefully making more clean energy here in ways that are smart and responsible, but really, really big opportunities. I did promise Fred I'd hit on a couple other Wisconsin pieces before we turn it over for questions. I appreciate everyone's hard work on PFAS, and I didn't fully appreciate until a few days ago, kind of the challenges that you've all been battling, trying to get common sense PFAS regulations through the legislature. In Delaware, I didn't actually have to run my regulations through the legislature, so I'm feeling a little guilty for some of the things we kind of pushed through without that level of oversight. But we're going to need federal standards. And I've had a conversation with Mike Regan, who's the new nominee. He did a great job as a secretary down in North Carolina. We worked a lot on PFAS specifically, and PFOA and the like. We're going to need national standards. I mean, we're going to need testing. It's a top priority for Tom Carper, who's a senator from Delaware who chairs the Environment and Public Works Committee. But we're going to, I think it's likely that the standards are going to have to come out of EPA. I'd love to see some kind of congressional commitment on that. There's been several attempts that got close, but haven't quite gotten around the line. But EPA has the authorities that it needs, at least from my reading of the Clean Water Act, as well as a few other statutes like RCRA and CERCLA. But I think the investment side is going to have to come from Congress, and the amount of money we need for remediation is massive. And it frankly is an area that we could all use help. And I think states lining up together, state agencies coming together, say PFAS remediation as part of a bigger brownfields and Superfund conversation could be very powerful. So that's one there. I should, as part of the Great Lakes, I should have mentioned Asian carp. I'm very proud of the work that so many of you have done on elevating this issue. We have a great young guy named Drew Youngdyke, who has done a wonderful job along with Mark Smith of our team, really making Asian carp a top priority for the Federation, for the region, for a lot of our partners. And hold on one second, I'm sorry. Sorry, Alana's being extracted from the room. The finally getting Illinois to kind of lean into the Brandon Lock and Dam project is incredibly important. But that's only one piece of the equation. Frankly, I think continuing to figure out ways to elevate the challenges of Asian carp is going to be incredibly important. I mean, I think we have to work together to get that project funded. But this is a scourge that the genie's already out of the bottle, but we just have to kind of stop the bleeding at this point. But I do see huge opportunities for investments that do try to reduce the populations of what I affectionately call the kind of spawn of Satan fish that is just absolutely terrifying. And one interesting note on this is that I'm increasingly seeing southern states leaning in. And granted, there's been obviously management challenges, further down the Mississippi that have contributed some of the challenges, but I'm seeing, leaders step up in places like Tennessee, places like Arkansas, places like Mississippi, and others beginning to, try to mitigate some of the harms that have been done, but also stop it from spreading into other, kind of freshwater systems in their states. So I think there's, again, regional collaboration opportunities in really, really smart ways. And then there's also a note here about the Conservation Reserve Program, which obviously it's incredibly important. The Trump administration abused it every single way. I mean, after such a bipartisan win on the Farm Bill, again, I mean, getting 25, 26 million acres wasn't enough. We were hoping for more like 40 or 50. But they did everything in their power to not implement that program well. We got a commitment from Secretary Vilsack, who I talked to a couple weeks ago about this, and Robert Bonney from his team to kind of keep the sign-up period open longer. But there's a lot of structural reforms we have to make. The reimbursement rates, there's all kinds of challenges in that system right now, and so that's going to be another kind of national priority because it is the most effective kind of land conservation program that we have on private lands right now, in terms of, especially in the prairies. And when you think about, the range of species from all the little brown jobber birds to the challenge we're facing with monarchs and swift fox, and it's a whole range of species. It's incredibly important. So that was a lot. I talk way too quickly. I know I always get accused of giving, kind of 5-hour speeches in 25 minutes, 30 minutes, but I want you all to be optimistic. There's a moment in time right now where real investment's possible if we have our act together and if we're kind of speaking with one voice. So I would love to hear from you about, kind of in the chat or offline about different priorities and how we put together those pieces. So, if Senator Baldwin or your delegation can kind of run with some of these ideas and how we can help lift them up. I mean, George does it. George, is, all of you know, is never shy to let us know what his priorities are and what we should be working on. And I think that, frankly, the more we're working together, the more we can make sure we look back at this moment and say, this is the moment we turn the corner. And frankly, started making investments that we should have been making for decades, but set us up to not only meet our climate goals, but also have healthier wildlife populations and healthier natural resources for decades to come. So, Kathleen?
Thank you, Colin. The questions and comments are pouring in, so I'm trying to organize them in a way that will be the most thoughtful for you to address. But I want to thank you for knowing our state so well. That means a lot to us. And so your advice and guidance and what you'll do at a national level, we know we are in good hands, always with your leadership. One of the themes that you have hit hard on to us today was think big. And with the dollars that are going to be invested and need to be invested, we ought to be at the table to get our fair share. And two opportunities that I know are very important to us here that I've seen reflected in the questions and comments. One is our big stewardship fund, that is the Wisconsin version of LawCon, is up for renewal this year. We will, of course, be lobbying hard, but with the important, what should we do to be able to help accelerate matching what could be new federal dollars with the very important Wisconsin stewardship fund, so we maximize both the dollars spent and how it is being spent.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think I didn't kind of highlight some of the big conservation wins last year, but I mean the Great American Outdoors Act passing the way it did with full permanent funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund is a game changer. And all of a sudden now, instead of worrying about what your allocation is going to be and like whether or not the money's going to be there and how you can leverage it, all of a sudden now you can start thinking big and start thinking multi-year and bigger landscapes. To not have that state match kind of readily available and predictable is going to prevent, I think, some of the bigger transactions from being seen as real. And so I think the case I would try to make in this is that those investments are going to be leveraged 1, 2, 3 times over, that every state dollar you get, you're going to be able to leverage, at least $1 of federal, if not more money in a way that's incredibly high impact. And so, we're also, another initiative I should have mentioned, there's this really exciting initiative called the Mississippi River Restoration and Resilience Initiative, MRRI, MRRI. And the idea is it's modeled after the Great Lakes program, which also has incredible leverage. And obviously, your team has done just great work over the years leveraging those dollars. But to do the same thing for the Mississippi. But again, there has to be state skin in the game. So whether it's NACA, whether it's this Murray program, whether it's the Great Lake Restoration Initiative, whether it's the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the federal money is going to be there. I think there's also opportunities with the Army Corps around restoration projects too, where sometimes the local and we're going to keep pushing them towards greener infrastructure. But I think the case to be made to the governor and the legislature is that the money's going to go to other states if Wisconsin doesn't have your match, if you don't have the other pieces of it. And so I'm guessing folks don't like it when money winds up in Michigan or Minnesota instead of Wisconsin. My governor was always funny. When I was battling with the OMB director during the Great Recession, I mean, my kind of magic ace card was always like, well, if you don't have the state money, then we're not gonna get the federal money. And all of a sudden the government would go nuts with the idea of like leaving money on the table. Like he just couldn't handle that. And so I'm guessing that's the same with Governor Evers. But I think that's the greatest case where like, if you don't have the state side, the federal side is going to be, the federal money is not going to wind up where you want it to.
Well, a corollary to that too, and the questions we're getting is, it's not just buying land, it's also restoring land. And that's I know an important mission to you. So is there any tweaking or adjustments to the federal program that we ought to be lobbying on to make sure it has this broader agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a fairly conscious attempt not to water down the land conservation value of LWCF. Mostly, we saw some attempts last few years to move it towards not so much about restoration, more about maintenance, and having maintenance of roads and trails and things that come out of this pot of money. And we've been advocating that there are other sources of funding for those types of programs. I mean, I think the most transformative land restoration opportunity in the country is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Because if the state wildlife agencies had, another $1.3 billion a year, and the tribes have another $100 million a year for on-the-ground restoration projects in conjunction with the state wildlife action plans, the amount of money that could leverage could be massive. The amount of work that could be done on the ground could be transformative, and it'd be done in a way that's ecologically appropriate and consistent. And so, I mean, I think programs like that, programs like NACA, programs like, we're trying to create a NACA for grasslands right now. This idea of that we've done such a great job, not great job, but we've done better conserving wetlands than grasslands. And so you could use that same model. But I mean, I think of it more as I think we're going to move towards the model towards maybe less acquisition and more easements. But I would rather have those monies going towards more permanent protection than having additional restoration pots supplementing to do the actual habitat restoration work on those lands.
Right. You've touched on something that has come up from at least 3 of our listeners and participants, and that is basically the conservation reserve program. It has been so successful on every level, from water quality to carbon sequestration and getting money into land, farmers' pockets. And it's just such a win-win, and it was starved under the prior administration. Do you see this as a priority for the new administration, and how do we help lift what just simply is a successful program?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And again, I mean, just on the politics of it, I mean, I do think that you have incredibly strong support for CRP from the president and Secretary Vilsack. And fortunately, the person that helped us, kind of just between all of us on the line, I mean, the person that helped us write the campaign CRP plan, a guy named Robert Bonney, who's kind of good friends with Kathleen and myself, is now the kind of the chief advisor for the Secretary of Interior. So I think we're in pretty good hands. I think we got some good folks in the right places. I mean, I want to see the number. I'd love to. I think we should be pushing for 45 or 50 million acres, and I'd love to see more money going into restoration, and not in thinking through how we connect a whole bunch of farm bill programs to actually get better ecological value. And I think when we think through the value of cover crops or additional plantings on the edges, or kind of additional values we can create, it's frankly a better. I mean, like, this is just me saying it, but like talking to a lot of my buddies in Delaware that farm, I mean, in some ways they'd rather be paid for doing that kind of conservation work than than other types of trade adjustment subsidies that may end any given time. They're not like predictable. And so I think there's a fairness piece to this also, where folks that are trying to make good conservation decisions and make good decisions for their land need to have confidence the federal programs are going to be there and be kind of fair to participate in. And so I think this will be an absolutely huge top priority. But I'd love to work with all. I do think Congressman Kind is kind of an interesting role, especially if Colin Peterson lost his election in Minnesota. There's I think having more champions in the region. I mean, Debbie Stabenow, the senior senator from Michigan, of course, will be. but having more folks, raising this is going to be important. And I think Tammy's or Senator Baldwin's in a good place too, to be a champion for this effort, because it's going to take a congressional push to get the funding levels up further.
We do have the age-old for us conservationist issue of regulation versus subsidies for trying to get farmers and rural landowners to do better by the environment. And there's so many different examples of that we could talk about, from CAFOs to other. So where do you see the tension and balance with both the new president and Secretary Vilsack and others? Secretary Vilsack has a strong record of conservation as a governor, and where do you see the direction going on that balance of regulation versus subsidy?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, this is the $1 trillion question, because it's obviously it's hard to regulate during the best of times. It's especially hard to regulate during economic downturns, and even with some of like the oil and gas leasing pause that the administration proposed, I mean, immediately the pushback was jobs, right? I mean, that's the argument. I think a lot of the working land standards or working lands kind of priorities initially are going to be more on the investment side, and I think there are standards around CAFOs and around some things around like nutrient management that are likely going to be kind of worked through, but I think it's going to take a little bit longer. I think you're going to see kind of carrots first, and then maybe using regulation to codify some of those gains. And like one thing the Obama administration I think got wrong was that they didn't really think through how investments and carrots intersect with a lot of the regulatory programs. And so like in the power sector, for example, just a simple example, they put standards for new power plants that assumed kind of carbon capture technology, but there wasn't a connection kind of explicitly with the various incentives to try to advance those technologies. And folks can debate the merits of those technologies. That's not the point of the example, but my point is that if you're smart about how farm bill programs help achieve water quality standards, and then think about how the regulations could be used to codify those kind of best practices because you're incentivizing them, all of a sudden then it's a way to, I don't want to say ease into it, but it's a way to kind of manage the transition towards better practices. Same thing on the carbon side. I think you're going to see huge investments. The work that Secretary Vilsack's talking about taking the credit corporation right now, the commodity credit corporation, and tweaking it to actually reward people for sequestering more carbon in their lands, basically turning a portion of it into a carbon bank where you're paying people for performance to basically have better practices, whether that's some changes in tillage, whether that's changes in cover crops, whether that's changes in restoring deep root grasses, whatever the case may be, manure management potentially. There's a lot of different opportunities, but then again, using those incentives to pay people for good things instead of just having these episodic bailouts when a trade deal closes markets for folks, I think is a pretty strategic conversation to have.
Actually, if you could speak a little bit more to it, we have many comments on energy, everything from how much more will we see on carbon tax credit kinds of regulation or policies, to what can the new administration be doing to help local governments, besides helping state governments do more energy, have a better energy future.
Yeah, I mean, I think just kind of focusing on the carbon pricing piece of it. I mean, there is bipartisan support. I mean, it's not particularly vocal, sorry. There is bipartisan support for pricing that's kind of emerging, not nearly 60 votes yet. I think having that conversation in the context of a recession makes it harder. But I think there's also folks that like the idea of driving those investments into the types of infrastructure that we're talking about and cleaner systems. There's also scenarios where you maybe don't put it in effect immediately. Maybe you delay it a few years, but then make some of the investments up front to help accelerate the transition. And so I think there's a bunch of different opportunities like this that will be part of the conversation. I'm guessing they don't land in the infrastructure conversation. I think that's going to be done by Memorial Day or maybe by the 4th of July. But I think it'd be part of the conversation. I think what you're more likely to see is massive investments in tax credits and grants and the like to help municipalities and states and businesses adopt cleaner sources of energy. And I think one of the challenges right now is that the level of Trump tax cuts were so deep that there's not a lot of tax appetite. And so like a lot of the credits that normally you could potentially sell to folks that had tax liability, they don't have as much. And so we're gonna have to turn a lot of those into grants, which will make them a little bit more, challenging to pass just because there's a little bit more money involved that way. I think we also have to work on wages and making sure that folks are paid fairly that are working in those sectors. But I think there's going to be a lot of help. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we were talking, $800 billion to $1 trillion between, across the energy portfolio total, to try to transform the system and move us towards cleaner sources, and clean up some of the existing sources.
Why don't we switch to a different topic here, because I know our time is going to be short. We've got one of our forest heroes, Don Waller, has asked you to address the question of how do we redirect U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, excuse me, to manage for more biodiversity and carbon sequestration, and how do we turn the ship there quickly?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and like, I mean, my organization was kind of built on the kind of the North American model, and really trying to think through. We helped lead our very first legislative victory was passing Pittman-Robertson, back in 1937, and that funding has done wonders, right? I mean, it helped recover so many species. The problem is that it did skew, priorities towards game species at the expense of the full biodiversity at both the state and the federal level. And so, I mean, my answer as a former state person was that it's money. If I predictably knew I had millions, tens of millions of dollars a year for sport fish and for deer and turkey and ducks, and then I had $1 million program for everything else, and it wasn't. And I think the evolution we went through in Delaware, which I've been trying to bring to the National Wildlife Service, is to start thinking of these systems as ecological systems. And so we're managing simultaneously. So as you're doing habitat work in a wildlife management area, we're also managing for pollinators and our monarchs or native bees. We're also managing for a whole range of species. I mean, thinking about how deer habitat potentially intersects with quail or other types of species. And so starting to think through these as systems. I do think that the scale of biodiversity loss among non-game species is so high right now that it's forcing the conversation. Because when you're looking at 12,000 species of greatest conservation need, I mean, the idea of having all those species listed is just massive. I mean, like, the system wasn't built for that. I mean, I don't know if it can handle it. I mean, I don't know if it can handle it politically. I don't know if it can handle it administratively. I don't know if it can handle it economically. And so this is, again, I keep coming back to the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. But like, I do think if you infused real money into state agencies to implement the state wildlife action plan, which are incredibly well done. I mean, I probably don't know as much about Wisconsin as I should, but like, I mean, the talent and the collaboration of building those plans is great. And then we basically don't fund them. It's kind of one of the great unfunded mandates. I think that's a way to turn the corner. Same thing on the federal side, right? I mean, the last administration obviously focused much more on the traditional game species side. But one of the things they did that I really liked was they had this big initiative around connectivity and migration corridors. Really exciting stuff, but they limited it to elk, mule deer, and pronghorn, where we should have been talking about moose. We should have been talking about aquatic passage. We should have been talking about a whole range of species. And so I think it's just a matter of trying to bring together the hunter angler groups, which we're a big part of, as well as the kind of the full biodiversity groups, having them start working together to try to advocate together for more funding for wildlife. Because I mean, outside of the dedicated funds that we have, I mean, the general revenues that we're spending at either the state or the federal level on wildlife management is almost non-existent. I mean, it's incredibly small. And it's one of the reasons why we're, kind of in this crouch with this mass extinction challenge that we're facing right now.
We have probably several questions and comments. There's a lot of interest here in energy and climate change. And one of the points you made early on was, thanks to the Biden's focus on climate change, it's permeating every agency and every topic. And that's really good news. But drilling down to specific regulatory schemes that President Trump unraveled, where should the priorities be there? President Biden took a lot of executive action and issued a lot of executive orders in his first days in office that are trying to stop some of those rules, or to at least look at them. What is your recommendation, or what is your vision of how those priorities are going to fall out, or what gets done first?
Yeah, I mean, if you look back at the Obama administration, I mean, I'd argue 80-90% of the focus was on the power sector. And that makes sense. I mean, it's, it's where 30% of the emissions come from. But it was, heavily focused there. very little forward movement on transportation outside of the
Colin, I hope you'll be able to come back shortly. You're frozen up right now. And it could be lunchtime for your young daughter. Well, Kathleen, this has been just a great conversation. I hope we'll be able to continue it.
Yeah, maybe if I turn my video off, that might help with the bandwidth.
I'm back. Sorry.
Great.
Sorry, I probably had a power glitch. We're getting snow here in Delaware, so I apologize. I'm back though. Sorry, I'm not sure where I cut out before I ran out the door to figure out what was going on with the power. So on the climate side, I mean, the focus on the power sector is going to continue. I think you're going to see a combination of incentives to try to drive market penetration. You're going to continue to see standards on power plants. I think one piece that the administration hasn't gotten right yet, that we're focused a lot on, is the transition piece. We haven't I grew up in upstate New York. I mean, you've had similar experiences in Wisconsin. I mean, we have not managed economic transitions well in this country for a century. We got destroyed by a lot of the trade deals in the 80s and 90s. I mean, like in Appalachia, there's all kinds of challenges. And so I want to make sure we're doing right by the workers. And it can't just be a hashtag. I mean, it needs real investments and real economic diversification. I think one of the big evolutions is moving to the transportation sector. The commitments around electric vehicles are real. And I think watching the private sector move so quickly with like GM's announcement after, kind of sidling up to Trump during the last administration, now, committing to going, all electric over the next 15 years, combined with what the president's talking about, related to federal procurement and the federal fleet. And you'll see more about that next week. There's just a lot of movement there, right? And I think you're going to see a transportation sector that on the lower and on the passenger vehicles, light duty vehicles, even mid duty vehicles are going to be electrified, and then the heavier duty stuff will probably be advanced biofuels eventually, aviation, shipping, and the like. But I think the other places, and this is a place where I think all of your expertise could be helpful. I think finally we're ready to have a conversation in this country about three sectors that don't nearly get enough attention. First one is the industrial sector, and thinking through how you reduce emissions in ways that still have domestic manufacturing. And I saw a note in the comment earlier about border adjustments. That's absolutely right. I mean, I think, we can't lose our ability to make things in this country because we're not figuring out ways to build into trade agreements, the massive kind of carbon imbalances in different production methods in different places. And so I think that conversation, it's a technical conversation, but it is rooted in the Clean Air Act. A lot of the tools are already there. Incredibly complex, but I mean, I want the America's clean energy future to be made in America, not made in China. And so thinking about ways to do that is going to be incredibly important for everything from cement, steel, aluminum. I mean, even just the aluminum manufacturing in Wisconsin. A friend of mine owns one of the big companies. I mean, like they're trying to figure out ways to make it much less carbon intensive, right now, but still be competitive. And then the second of the three is agriculture and forestry. The working land side is received a fraction of the attention. I think it's mostly going to be incentive based at the beginning. The credit corporation is one idea. I think there's a lot of opportunities on tax credits and other types of treatment for folks that are sequestering more carbon. Again, ways that are additive and ways that are permanent, but thinking through both those, what kind of the working lands, and I'd include ranching in that too. And then the third one is on the natural solutions side, which is in some ways it's gotten a little bit of a bad name, but 25% of our emissions we could potentially sequester through natural systems, and so through additive, additional, and so again that requires massive investments. But I think those five pieces and those kind of last three that receive the least attention is one way to think about it. Now, how you downscale those to make sure that states that have adopted 100% clean energy goals or cities that have can participate and kind of leverage their expertise and have local solutions make sense is going to be key. And I've been pushing the administration to think about more like block grants and different types of location-based incentives as opposed to one size fits all. Because what's going to work in Wisconsin is different than what's going to fit in upstate New York, right? I mean, I think there's different needs, there's existing infrastructure that's different strengths. And so trying to find a hybrid where you're kind of setting goals together, but you're not trying to be uniform in the way we achieve those goals, I think is going to be the fastest path to actually get there.
Why don't we switch in some of our remaining minutes here to some water regulations and water issues? You commented briefly in your opening remarks, Colin, about PFAS, and I know when I started out doing this work 50 years ago, we had just passed the Clean Water Act and the whole onslaught of brand new environmental laws then, and if we thought 50 years later we would be having a conversation about not being able to eat bluegills out of my favorite fish I fish in, I would have been shocked. 50 years later, and we still can't eat fish. So, well, it's so important and inspiring that President Obama has reinvigorated science into the federal government perspective. For us, still in many states where our DNR is battling a legislature that just doesn't want any regulation to happen, getting even minimal action on things like PFAS has been really heavy lifting. So, what do we not only we know what we're facing in Wisconsin, but how on a national level, given the pressure that will come to bear against the government doing further regulations on things like PFAS, how can we be successful?
Yeah, I mean, the attack we've seen on science and the attack we've seen just on facts, the last few years has been heartbreaking. And unfortunately, you guys were living it before a lot of the rest of the country, during the Walker years. And I think we just have to be, I don't think this is the kind of, and one of my very first internships was for a former senator from New York, kind of the legendary Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And, he used to always, his favorite saying, you'd bring in the intern classes and always say, if you only learn one thing from me, learn this. And, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. and he would kind of browbeat that into all of us. And 20 years later, I remember it. I don't think it's enough just to get the facts out. I think we have to do a better job explaining how we're going to achieve the outcomes. And I think we have to be more creative of thinking which piece, and it gets back to our earlier back and forth around which pieces should be done through incentives, which pieces need to be done through regulation. And I think water quality is one of the toughest ones in fish health in particular, because a lot of the investments, the results aren't immediate. Right. If there's pollution, if there's a scrubber put on a coal plant, right? You can see emission reductions almost immediately. Where if we're making a bunch of investments in cover crops or vegetative buffers or whatever the like may be, the long-term benefits are massive, but you're not going to see you're not going to see fewer algal blooms the next day. And so I do think figuring out ways to be very clear about kind of what the path to success looks like, and then being honest about the timelines. I think with things that bioaccumulate with different types of toxins, say it's just these PCBs, for example. We've done a lot of work across the country trying to find innovative ways to activated carbon to try to get PCBs out of the water column, and you can see improvements almost overnight. It's not the same thing with nitrogen and phosphorus, though, right? They're just different challenges. And so again, even this conversation's kind of taken a more technical turn than I wanted it to, because I always think about how would my dad's buddies react to the way I'm explaining stuff, and they just want to be able to eat the fish, right? They just want to be able to go fishing. They just want to know that it's safe to eat, and they don't want to have only one every other year because they're concerned about mercury content. So I think making the case for what the path to success looks like, also making the case of what inaction looks like, right, and kind of having that off, and then layering in the economic consequences, because places that have healthy fisheries have healthier economies, right? The places that have healthier water have healthier kids and less healthcare costs. But again, I worry about it because we answer in paragraphs, right? Where other folks are regulation kills jobs. They say 3 words and we need 7 paragraphs to describe, the counterpoint. So, again, I wish I had a better answer for you, but we're going to see this play out in real time right now in the states of Idaho, Wisconsin, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, as we have a conversation about restoring salmon runs in that part of the country. We've been working on this plan for a couple of years. But the idea is to invest in a whole bunch of parts of the economy to try to diversify and try to bring back these runs. And a piece of that is taking out a few dams. But that you need that this approach is actually going to be more an investment-led approach. It's actually be more successful than the regulatory approach that frankly hasn't gotten us nearly where we need to go because you weren't willing to address the underlying problem, which is fish passage. I think that's the conversation that all of you are kind of uniquely positioned to have, having been on the other side of the table and knowing where the where do you actually need the regulatory tool, and where are other places where if you just had enough money you could buy your way to the outcome you want.
Now we've got a number of questions along. This is a very pragmatic group of participants you have here. Very pragmatic. You know, we see the ping pong that happens on terribly important issues from administration and administration, whether it's fight over pipelines, or how do you define waters of the nation for regulatory purposes, just those big issues, ping pong back and forth. And it's hard then for the public to see this as anything but political as opposed to making progress. Any suggestions on what we can do a better job on in showing progress so that people continue to stay engaged and work on these tough issues?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And look, and if you're building a 7-year transmission project, right, that's got potential implications for the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, just for example, like I don't know how you plan right now. And the additional variable, in addition to kind of the complexity of your question, is actually the courts. And just as the courts have become more conservative and in some cases a little more hostile to regulatory actions and kind of questioning Chevron deference and other kind of traditional precedent, it is uneven. I think there's a level of humility, especially among environmental regulators, that's going to be necessary to really kind of make sure that what you're promulgating does kind of fall within the bounds of the law. I think the uncertainty coming from court decisions, particularly related to water, is incredibly challenging in years ahead. Where, I mean, at least the Clean Air Act, you have expertise on the DC Circuit. You can, you for the most part, even there's been, with the exception of Kavanaugh and a few others, I mean, there's been fairly bipartisan. I don't want to call them partisan judges, but judges appointed by both Republicans and Democrats have upheld basic tenets of the Clean Air Act for a long time. The Clean Water Act is still a little bit of the wild, wild west. And so, I worries me, like on the waters of the US, that a single judge in North Dakota, right, can try to undo like an entire national standard, or at least do it for his region. And so, I mean, one thing I've been pushing the administration on is like really like doing the stress test of exactly what do we think will hold up to court scrutiny. If there are legal pieces that we need, doing some things in Congress potentially to strengthen the act, because if we don't think the legal underpinning is there, having things get overturned and losing another decade of progress, as we're already losing so many acres of wetlands, we're seeing so many pollutants coming into our headwaters. It's just an opportunity we can't afford to miss. So I'd rather get 90% of what we want in a certain way than trying to get 100%, but having potentially losing all of that because we lose in the courts. And again, that's not the consensus position, right? I mean, a lot of our colleagues, want that, we want the 100%, yesterday, and I get that, but I mean, we're losing decades at a time right now with this, the ping pong, as you called it.
Why don't we give you a chance in this final question here to speak really directly to the young audience that's with us today. For example, the UW, University of Wisconsin Stevens Point campus, their Wildlife Society organization is online here, and it's just the simple question of what can they do from that corner of the world to buoy up these issues and be successful on big issues like climate change.
Yeah, I mean, look, I come out of a little bit of an activist tradition. Don't wait. I mean, I think, I don't want to disparage anybody on the call, but you're inheriting a world that's got a ton of challenges right now that's going to require new thinking and frankly more energy. And one of the things that I spend a lot of time on is trying to bring groups together that should be working together, but have just allowed individual issue differences or even just cultural differences to prevent them from collaborating. Like the solutions of the 21st century are going to be intersectional. Now, the president got it right by talking about how these different historic challenges that we're facing actually fit together. And so I would just think about how do you build as big of a tent as possible, as many different collaborative partners as you possibly can. I mean, folks that care about public health also care about environmental impacts because they can't achieve their outcomes unless we reduce, kind of sources of illness in the natural environment. Folks that care about, justice and making sure that there's equitable opportunity and that we're kind of trying to break down racist systems, also care about the impacts of pollution disproportionately affecting different communities. And so I think thinking about these is not as academic environmental challenges, but as solutions that we need to frankly help folks fulfill their potential, help us meet our climate goals, help us rebuild our economies, help us create opportunity, is a much bigger frame, and it's a much more inclusive frame. I can talk till I'm blue in the face about parts per million of this or that. At the end of the day, the average Wisconsinite just wants to have healthy kids, right? They go to a good school, they have a job that can pay for their pay for their home and hopefully pay for a little, additional education if that's in the cards. And there's things that we so often make so technical and so complicated, where frankly, when we just make the more common sense case, we can get folks on board. Now, politics has made a lot of these issues, toxic and more partisan than they should be. But that hasn't always been the case and doesn't always need to be the case. And I'll just end with this. Last year was a brutal election for a lot of people. A lot of elected officials had no idea which way it was going to go. And one of the spaces that a lot of them turned back to try to salvage their political careers was conservation. Some of the most bipartisan kind of piece of legislation last year was in conservation. I'm not questioning their motives. I mean, I come from the Joe Biden school. If you don't question folks' motives, but I will say that, it's interesting to me that at a time when folks were trying to, save their careers, that conservation was seen as a place to go. Now, how do we take advantage of that going forward? It's really making the case, and it's showing that this isn't just a, upper middle class white, concern. This is a concern for everybody. And how the way we enter the issue may be a little different. But my advice to you is simply, be loud, be vocal, be specific with solutions. Talk about locally relevant solutions. I think so often, in my organization in the past, got in trouble for talking more about polar bears and puffins than talking about, people getting flooded out or fires raging on the landscape. I think be authentic, but have ideas for, things you want to see in your community, and then be vocal about it and tell groups like ours to help you, to be kind of servant leaders to help you get it done. I think that's where the magic happens. But I just think, there's a moment right now. Now we're going to remake a whole lot of things the next few years. And if we do it right, the natural resource kind of restoration resilience will be at the absolute heart of it.
Well, thank you, Colin, so much for taking your time now. But more importantly, thank you for your lifelong service. And I know you have our back here in Wisconsin, but I hope you know that we have your back too. And anything we can do to help you succeed for all of us, please count on.
No, I appreciate that. So I'm a closet cheesehead. So my sister went to school with Aaron Rodgers, and so I feel so they're at Berkeley at the same time. She was playing lacrosse and he was playing football, of course. And so I feel like I'm an adoptive person in Wisconsin. And frankly, I do thank George. I mean, George has done a hell of a job over the last 5 years, making sure that issues ranging from wolves to water and everything in between, we're front and center for the Federation. And so, anything I can do, let me know. But I'd love to work together more closely.
Well, I'm ready to vote for Alana for president, so I hope she grows up quick. Thank you again.
Colin,
I'm going to turn this back to Fred. Fred, I just want to thank you and Greenfire for all you do every single day out of the, you just step up, all you smart, able, skilled people to make a difference. And thanks for including me today. And thank you for all you do and put us to work.
Thank you, Kathleen. And it's been a great conversation. Colin, I have 2 pages of the notes from hearing your reactions and what you had to say. And I'm only sorry that in this format, you're not able to see all of our audience, because I know that everyone that heard this program today came away engaged and inspired. And, someone made a comment in the chat box, at last, a systems thinker. And, but I think that's right. What we're hearing here are new ways of thinking about our conservation challenges and the needs ahead of us and how to address them. And this is just really inspiring. So I know that as an organization, we're looking more to Washington and more to our federal partners for how to fulfill our mission and how to do our part in, the conservation legacy of this state and this country. And you've helped us think about how to do that more effectively today. So I hope we can all stay in touch. George, any last words before we wrap up? You're on mute, George.
Just briefly, Colin, thank you so much for being here. And for many of you that haven't heard Colin before, he has been an outstanding leader, and you can see why. He does get the big picture, and he has done a great job organizing not just his staff, but all 53 affiliates to work to a common goal. And it's been wonderful working with him, and he will continue to do that many years in the future.
Very good. Well, the conversation continues. And thanks to all of our participants today for joining and taking your time. And Kathleen, George, and especially Colin, thanks for being with us. And we'll look forward to the next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.